Throughout the Bible, there are moments where God warns his people and they refuse to listen. What follows is never random. It is always a consequence. Today we are going to walk through every major time Israel was punished for ignoring God's warnings. And some of these stories are far more intense than you might expect. From the golden calf at the foot of Mount Sinai to the complete destruction of Jerusalem and the scattering of an entire nation, God gave warning after warning after warning. But his people kept turning away. So, what happened each time they did? Let's go through them one by one. The first example goes all the way back to the wilderness. Right after God rescued Israel from Egypt in one of the most dramatic displays of power in all of history, he split the sea, he drowned their enemies, he led them with a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. He brought them to Mount Sinai and spoke to them directly. But while Moses was on the mountain receiving the 10 Commandments, the people below grew restless. They went to Aaron and said, "Make us gods who will go before us." So Aaron collected their gold jewelry and fashioned a golden calf. They bowed down to it. They offered sacrifices to it. They threw a party and declared that this was the God who brought them out of Egypt. Now think about that for a second. They were standing at the very mountain where God's presence was visibly resting. The smoke and fire were right there above them. And still they chose to worship a statue made from melted earrings. God told Moses what was happening and said he was ready to destroy the entire nation and start over with Moses alone. Moses interceded. He pleaded with God to remember his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God relented from total destruction. But there were still consequences. Moses came down, smashed the tablets, burned the calf, ground it to powder, mixed it with water, and made the people drink it. Then the Levites went through the camp, and about 3,000 people were killed that day. A plague also followed. The people were punished not because God was cruel, but because they had been warned. They had seen his power, they had heard his voice, and they chose a golden statue instead. But the rebellion did not stop there. In fact, it only got worse. Not long after the golden calf incident, the Israelites arrived at the border of the Promised Land. God told them to send spies into Canaan. 12 men went in. They came back with fruit so large, it took 2 men to carry a single cluster of grapes. The land was everything God had promised, but 10 of the 12 spies were terrified. They said the people there were giants. They said the cities were too fortified. They said Israel could never take the land. Only Joshua and Caleb believed God could do what he said he would do. So what did the people do? They wept all night. They grumbled against Moses and Aaron. They talked about choosing a new leader and going back to Egypt, back to slavery. That was their solution. God had delivered them through the sea, fed them with manna, given them water from a rock, defeated their enemies, led them with his visible presence, and now they wanted to go back to the place where they had been beaten and worked to death, making bricks. God's response was severe. He told them that every single adult who had seen his miracles in Egypt and in the wilderness and still refused to trust him would never set foot in the Promised Land. Not one of them. They would wander in the desert for 40 years. 1 year for every day the spies had spent exploring the land. An entire generation would die in the wilderness. Only Joshua and Caleb would survive to enter Canaan. The 10 faithless spies were struck dead immediately by a plague. And when some of the people tried to reverse course and charge into the land on their own without God's blessing, they were crushed by the Amalekites and Canaanites. God had warned them. He had shown them what he could do, but they refused to believe him. So they spent 4 decades walking in circles until every doubter was buried in the sand. Now you would think after 40 years in the desert, the next generation would have learned their lesson. But the pattern continued. Right before Israel was about to finally cross into the Promised Land, they camped at a place called Shittim on the plains of Moab. The Moabite women invited the Israelite men to their feasts and their sacrifices. The men joined in. They ate food offered to false gods. They bowed down to Baal of Peor. They committed sexual immorality as part of pagan worship rituals. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate turning away. The king of Moab had actually hired a prophet named Balaam to curse Israel, but God would not allow it. So instead, Balaam advised the Moabites to seduce Israel into sin. It worked. God's anger burned against them. He told Moses to execute the ringleaders and hang them in broad daylight as a warning to the rest. Then, a plague broke out among the people. While Moses and the leaders were weeping at the entrance of the tabernacle, one Israelite man brazenly brought a Midianite woman into his tent, right in front of everyone. Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, grabbed a spear and followed them in and killed them both. Only then did the plague stop. But by that point, 24,000 people had already died. God had brought them to the edge of the promise, and they threw it away for a foreign god and a weekend of indulgence. So Israel eventually enters the land under Joshua. They conquer Jericho in a miraculous victory. God tells them not to take any of the devoted things from the city. Everything in Jericho was to be destroyed or set apart for the Lord. But a man named Achan could not resist. He saw a beautiful robe, some silver, and a bar of gold. He took them and buried them under his tent. Israel did not know about Achan's sin, but God did. When they went to attack the small city of Ai expecting an easy win, they were routed. 36 men were killed and the army fled in terror. Joshua fell on his face before God and asked what had happened. God told him that Israel had sinned. Someone had taken what was forbidden. Until the sin was dealt with, God would not be with them in battle. Achan was identified. He confessed. And he, along with his family and all his possessions, were taken to the valley of Achor and stoned. Then they were burned. It seems extreme, but the principle was clear. One man's hidden sin brought defeat on the entire nation. God had given a direct command. Achan ignored it, and the consequences were devastating not just for him, but for everyone around him. After the conquest was complete and Joshua had died, Israel entered one of its darkest seasons. The book of Judges is essentially the same cycle repeated over and over. The people abandon God. They worship the gods of the nations around them. God allows an enemy to rise up and oppress them. The people cry out in distress. God raises up a judge to deliver them. There is peace for a while. Then the people turn away again, and the whole cycle restarts. But each cycle gets worse. The judges become more flawed. The people become more corrupt, and the consequences become more severe. One of the clearest examples is the story of Samson. God set him apart from birth as a Nazirite with supernatural strength. But Samson was reckless. He chased foreign women. He played games with his calling. He ignored every boundary God had set for him. Eventually, Delilah wore him down, and he revealed the secret of his strength. The Philistines captured him, gouged out his eyes, and put him to work grinding grain like an animal. The man who could have been Israel's greatest champion ended up blind and in chains because he treated God's gifts as a joke. But Samson was just one man. The broader nation was no better. By the end of Judges, the text says, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no moral compass, no spiritual center. The final chapters describe horrific events, including a civil war that nearly wiped out the entire tribe of Benjamin. Israel had been warned through the law of Moses, through the pattern of consequences, through every judge God raised up. But they kept choosing their own way, and it kept leading to ruin. Eventually, Israel demands a king. God warns them through the prophet Samuel that a king will tax them and draft their sons and take their daughters and claim their fields. But the people insist. They want to be like the other nations. So God gives them Saul. Saul starts well. He is tall and impressive. He wins early battles. But he quickly reveals a pattern of disobedience. When told to wait for Samuel before offering a sacrifice, Saul grows impatient and does it himself. When told to completely destroy the Amalekites and everything they own, Saul spares the king and the best of the livestock. He keeps what looks valuable and destroys only what seems worthless. When Samuel confronts him, Saul makes excuses. He blames the people. He says the animals were saved for a sacrifice to God. Samuel's response is one of the most quoted lines in the Old Testament. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice. God rejected Saul as king, not because Saul made a small mistake, but because Saul consistently chose his own judgment over God's command. The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. He spent the rest of his reign jealous and paranoid, trying to kill David, whom God had already chosen as his replacement. Saul's kingdom crumbled. His sons died in battle. And Saul himself fell on his own sword. He had been warned. He had been given every opportunity, but he chose pride over obedience, and it cost him everything. David was different in many ways. He was called a man after God's own heart. But even David was not immune to the consequences of ignoring what he knew to be right. At a time when kings were supposed to be leading their armies in battle, David stayed home. From his rooftop he saw Bathsheba bathing. He sent for her. He slept with her. She became pregnant. David tried to cover it up by calling her husband Uriah back from the front lines, hoping he would go home to his wife. But Uriah was more honorable than the king. He refused to enjoy comfort while his fellow soldiers were in the field. So David sent Uriah back to the battle with a letter ordering his commander to put Uriah in the most dangerous position and then pull back so he would be killed. It worked. Uriah died. David married Bathsheba. And for a moment, it seemed like he had gotten away with it. But God sent the prophet Nathan, who told David a story about a rich man who stole a poor man's only lamb. David was furious and said the man deserved to die. Nathan looked at him and said, "You are the man." David repented deeply. Psalm 51 is his broken cry for mercy, and God forgave him, but the consequences still came. The child born from that affair died. Violence and rebellion tore through David's family for the rest of his life. His son Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar. Another son, Absalom, killed Amnon and then led a coup against David himself. David was driven out of Jerusalem by his own son. The sword never departed from his house, just as God had said. Even for a man after God's own heart, disobedience carried a cost that forgiveness did not erase. After David came Solomon. God appeared to Solomon and told him to ask for anything. Solomon asked for wisdom. God was pleased and gave him wisdom, along with wealth and honor beyond measure. Solomon built the temple. He wrote Proverbs. He was the wisest and richest man alive. But he had a fatal weakness. Solomon married 700 wives and had 300 concubines. Many of them were from nations God had specifically told Israel not to intermarry with because they would turn their hearts to other gods. And that is exactly what happened. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after their gods. He built high places for Chemosh and Molech and other detestable idols. The wisest man who ever lived became a fool because he ignored the clearest warning God had given. God told Solomon that because of this, he would tear the kingdom away from his son. Not all of it because of the promise to David, but most of it. And that is exactly what happened. After Solomon died, his son Rehoboam listened to foolish advisers and crushed the people with even heavier burdens. 10 of the 12 tribes revolted under Jeroboam and formed the northern kingdom of Israel. The nation that God had united under David was ripped in two, all because Solomon thought he could disobey God and get away with it. Now the northern kingdom was doomed from the start. Jeroboam, the first king of the breakaway nation, was afraid that if his people kept going to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, they would eventually return their loyalty to the king of Judah. So he created his own religion. He set up 2 golden calves, one in Bethel and one in Dan, and told the people, "Here are your gods who brought you out of Egypt." He appointed his own priests from people who were not Levites. He created his own festivals. He built his own shrines. Sound familiar? It was the golden calf all over again. And God sent prophet after prophet to warn the northern kings. Elijah confronted Ahab and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Fire fell from heaven. The false prophets were destroyed, but Ahab and his wife Jezebel continued in their wickedness. Elisha performed miracle after miracle as a sign of God's power and compassion. But the nation kept spiraling. King after king in the north did evil in the sight of the Lord. There was not a single good king in the entire history of the northern kingdom of Israel. Not one. God sent warnings. He sent drought. He sent famine. He sent prophets. He sent military pressure. But the nation would not repent. Finally, in 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire swept in and conquered the northern kingdom. The people were deported and scattered among foreign nations. They were resettled and intermixed with other conquered peoples. The 10 tribes of the north essentially ceased to exist as a distinct people. This was not a random geopolitical event. It was the direct result of centuries of rebellion against God. He had warned them, he had pleaded with them, he had given them every chance, but they chose idols over the living God, so he let them go. But the southern kingdom of Judah did not learn from their brother's destruction. You would think watching 10 tribes get carted off into oblivion would be enough to get your attention. But Judah had their own problems. They had good kings mixed in with terrible ones. Hezekiah brought revival. His son Manasseh brought some of the worst idolatry Judah had ever seen. Manasseh rebuilt the high places his father had torn down. He set up altars to Baal. He put an idol inside the temple. He practiced sorcery and divination. He sacrificed his own son in the fire. 2 Kings says Manasseh shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. God said because of what Manasseh had done, he would bring disaster on Jerusalem that would make the ears of everyone who heard about it tingle. Josiah came after Manasseh and brought the greatest revival Judah had ever seen. He found the book of the law in the temple, which had apparently been lost and forgotten. When it was read aloud, he tore his robes in grief because he realized how far the nation had strayed. He purged the land of idols. He renewed the covenant. He celebrated Passover like it had not been celebrated in generations. But even Josiah's reforms were not enough to turn back the judgment God had already decreed because of Manasseh's sins and the deep corruption of the people. God sent Jeremiah to warn Judah for decades. Jeremiah preached and wept and pleaded. He told them that Babylon was coming. He told them to surrender and they would live. He told them that the exile would last 70 years, but that God would bring them back. The leaders mocked him. They threw him in a cistern. They accused him of treason. They ignored every single word. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, besieged Jerusalem. The famine grew so severe that people resorted to cannibalism. The walls were breached. The king tried to flee and was captured. His sons were killed before his eyes, and then his own eyes were gouged out so that the last thing he ever saw was the death of his children. The temple that Solomon had built was looted and burned to the ground. The walls of the city were demolished. The people were marched into exile in Babylon. The Book of Lamentations captures the grief. How deserted lies the city once so full of people. She who was great among the nations has become a slave. The destruction of Jerusalem was not an accident. It was not fate. It was the consequence of generations of ignoring God's warnings. He had sent Moses. He had sent judges. He had sent kings. He had sent prophet after prophet after prophet. And the people said no. But even in exile, God did not abandon his people. He had already told Jeremiah that the exile would last 70 years. He promised, through Ezekiel, that he would give them a new heart and a new spirit. He promised through Isaiah that a servant would come to bear their sins and bring them back to God. The exile was punishment, yes, but it was also preparation. God was not finished with Israel. He was refining them. After 70 years, just as God had promised, the Persian king Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. But when they got back and started rebuilding, they grew complacent. They built nice houses for themselves, but left the temple in ruins. God sent the prophet Haggai to confront them. He said, "You expected much, but it turned out to be little. Why? Because my house remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house." God had brought them back from exile. He had opened the door for restoration. But they got comfortable. They prioritized their own comfort over God's house. So God withheld the rain. The harvests were poor. The economy suffered, not because God was petty, but because they were repeating the same pattern their ancestors had followed. They were putting themselves first, and God second. The people listened to Haggai. They got back to work. The temple was rebuilt, but the bigger lesson was clear. Every single time Israel ignored God's warnings, there were consequences. Not because God enjoyed punishing them, but because he is holy and he takes his word seriously. When you step back and look at the whole story from the golden calf to the destruction of Jerusalem, the pattern is unmistakable. God warns. The people ignore. Consequences follow. God restores. And then the cycle starts again. It is a story of relentless rebellion met by relentless love. God never stopped pursuing his people. He never stopped sending messengers. He never stopped offering a way back. And that is ultimately what makes this story so powerful. It is not just a list of punishments. It is a portrait of a God who refuses to give up. Every judgment was an invitation to return. Every consequence was proof that God cared enough to discipline rather than abandon. The writer of Hebrews would later say, "The Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son." Israel's story is a mirror. It reflects back to us the same temptation we all face. The temptation to hear God's word and nod along, but then live as if it does not apply to us. To enjoy the blessings and forget the one who gave them. To grow comfortable and let our hearts drift. But here is the hope woven through every one of these stories. God's mercy always outlasts his judgment. The exile ended. The temple was rebuilt. And centuries later, God did not send another prophet or another judge. He sent his own son. Jesus came as the ultimate fulfillment of every promise God had made. He bore the consequences, that his people deserved. He took the punishment on himself so that anyone who trusts in him would never face final judgment. The warnings in Scripture are real, the consequences are real, but so is the grace. And that grace did not start in the New Testament. It was there all along. In every warning, in every second chance, in every prophet sent to a stubborn people. God has always been in the business of rescue. The question has always been whether his people would listen.